Have you ever wondered if ancient wisdom could truly coexist with modern science? A question as old as time, yet as urgent as ever in today's restless, hyper-connected world. In a universe where galaxies spin in silence and neurons fire inside the vast landscape of our minds, two seemingly different worlds have long walked separate paths: the empirical certainty of science and the introspective, mystical realm of Buddhism. But do they have to be at odds? Let's begin with a story. It's the late 20th century. A brilliant young physicist named David Bohm, one of Einstein's last protégés, is consumed by questions about the nature of reality. His groundbreaking work in quantum mechanics leaves him restless. Equations can predict subatomic behavior, but what about the observer? What about consciousness? What about meaning? In search of answers, Bohm turns to an unlikely source: the teachings of an ancient Indian sage known as the Buddha. As strange as it seems, Bohm finds in Buddhist philosophy an uncanny echo of quantum theory's most puzzling insights. He realizes both science and Buddhism speak of a world where nothing exists independently, where everything is interconnected, ever-changing, and ultimately unknowable. And so, a question rises, not just for Bohm, but for all of us. Can science and Buddhism truly coexist? Or are they destined to forever speak different languages? To answer this, we first need to understand how these two systems think. Science, in its purest form, seeks objective truth through observation, experimentation, and evidence. It's about uncovering the laws that govern the physical universe. It builds rockets, deciphers DNA, and peers into distant galaxies. It dissects matter, seeking to measure, predict, and control. Buddhism, on the other hand, turns inward. It isn't concerned with what lies beyond the stars, but with what stirs within the heart. It's a path of introspection, of observing the restless mind, the fleeting emotions, the ache of suffering, and the search for peace. While science looks outward to explain the how, Buddhism asks inwardly about the why. Why do we suffer? Why do we chase illusions? Why does the mind never rest? At first glance, they seem worlds apart, but dig a little deeper, and surprising bridges begin to appear. Both disciplines, at their core, demand direct experience. The Buddha himself warned, "Believe nothing, no matter where you read it or who has said it, unless it agrees with your own reason and your own experience." And science too thrives on observation, not on dogma, but on repeatable, verifiable facts. Both reject blind faith. Both demand evidence. Both embrace curiosity as a virtue. Even more astonishing is how modern physics and ancient Buddhist teachings independently arrived at similar views about the nature of reality. In quantum mechanics, particles exist in multiple states until observed. Reality seems to depend on the observer. In Buddhism, all phenomena are considered empty of inherent existence, arising only in dependence on conditions, an idea known as pratyasamutpada, or dependent origination. The parallels are striking, not because Buddhism predicted particle physics, but because both systems, in their pursuit of truth, stripped away assumptions about a fixed, objective reality. And then there's the mind. Neuroscience today maps brain waves, studies meditation, and explores consciousness, a realm Buddhism has charted for millennia through introspection. Modern psychology increasingly acknowledges what Buddhist monks have taught for over 2,500 years, that the mind shapes experience, and that freedom lies not in changing the world, but in changing the way we perceive it. Of course, tensions remain. Science deals in what is measurable. Buddhism dares to explore what is ineffable. Science is cautious about metaphysical claims, while Buddhism speaks of rebirth, karma, and nirvana, concepts yet beyond the reach of any lab. But must disagreement mean conflict? Or could it be that they are simply two languages describing different aspects of the same truth? As Albert Einstein once said, the religion of the future will be a cosmic religion. It should transcend personal gods and avoid dogmas and theology. Covering both the natural and the spiritual, it should be based on a religious sense arising from the experience of all things natural and spiritual as a meaningful unity. Is it possible that what we call science and what we call Buddhism are simply two ways of navigating the same mystery? That the telescope and the meditation cushion both point to the same unfathomable universe, one outside and one within? In this series, we will follow that question. We'll explore where these paths intersect, where they clash, and where they might beautifully, unexpectedly, complement each other. Before we can understand how science might intersect or conflict with Buddhism, we first need to understand what science truly is. It might seem obvious. We think of science as microscopes, telescopes, lab coats, and chalkboards filled with complicated equations. But science, at its core, is something much simpler and far more profound. At its essence, science is a method, a way of knowing. It's humanity's ongoing quest to uncover the hidden laws of nature, to peel back the layers of mystery cloaking the world around us. It's a process built on observation, skepticism, and relentless curiosity. Unlike ancient mythologies or traditional belief systems, science doesn't begin with conclusions. It begins with questions. Why do objects fall to the ground? What causes the stars to shine? How does the mind experience emotion? These questions ignite the spark of inquiry, and from there, science demands evidence, observable, measurable, and repeatable evidence. Let's take a simple example. Imagine you notice the sun rises in the east and sets in the west every day. A myth might explain this with the story of a sun god pulling a chariot across the sky. But science asks, can we test this? Can we predict it? Can we measure it? Through observation and calculation, ancient astronomers discovered patterns in celestial motion. Over centuries, those observations gave birth to models, from geocentric to heliocentric, and finally, to the modern understanding of our solar system's mechanics. This is the nature of science. It builds models of reality based on evidence, and it continuously updates those models when new evidence appears. One of the most beautiful and perhaps humbling aspects of science is its willingness to admit when it's wrong. In fact, that's what makes it powerful. Newton's laws explained gravity for centuries, until Einstein came along and showed us space and time are woven together in a flexible fabric, bending under the weight of mass and energy. What we once believed to be absolute turned out to be a special case within a larger, stranger truth. This capacity to evolve is the beating heart of science. But here's the important thing. Science has boundaries. By its very nature, science is confined to the observable, measurable universe. It can study neurons firing in the brain, but cannot directly measure a thought. It can map the structure of the heart, but cannot quantify love. It can track the chemical changes during meditation, but cannot grasp the subjective stillness within. This isn't a flaw. It's simply the nature of the method. To function, science relies on certain assumptions, that there is an objective reality independent of our perceptions, that the laws of nature are consistent and universal, that events have causes which can be discovered through investigation. These assumptions are pragmatic and so far incredibly successful. They've given us antibiotics, space exploration, artificial intelligence, and an expanding comprehension of the universe. But there are questions science struggles to answer. Why does consciousness exist? Is the universe finite or infinite? What happens after death? Is there an ultimate meaning to life? These aren't questions of how, but of why. And traditionally, such questions have been the domain of philosophy, religion, and mysticism, Buddhism included. The modern era often paints science as the sole authority on truth, but wise scientists know better. Take Richard Feynman, one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century. He once said, "I have a friend who's an artist and has sometimes taken a view which I don't agree with very well. He'll hold up a flower and say, 'Look how beautiful it is,' and I'll agree. But then he'll say, 'You see, as an artist, I can see how beautiful a flower is. But you as a scientist, take it all apart and it becomes dull.' I think he's kind of nutty. I can appreciate the beauty of a flower." At the same time, I see much more about the flower than he sees. I see its cells, its biology, its complex workings, and I find that just as beautiful. Science doesn't destroy beauty, it reveals deeper beauty. But it does so by limiting itself to certain kinds of knowledge, the physical, the measurable, the external. Which brings us to a subtle but important truth. Science is brilliant at explaining the outer world, but struggles to grasp the inner world. When it comes to subjective experience, to the sensation of joy, grief, awe, or the profound silence of a mind in meditation, science can measure correlates in the brain, but not the experience itself. This isn't a failure of science. It's a recognition of the different layers of reality. The philosopher Thomas Nagel once posed the famous question, "What is it like to be a bat?" Science can measure a bat's echolocation, its neural pathways, and its behavior, but it cannot capture what it feels like to perceive the world as a bat does. In the same way, science can study the brain of a meditating monk, but it cannot directly access the stillness within his mind. This limitation isn't a flaw. It's a reminder that no single method captures the totality of existence, which is where other traditions, like Buddhism, come in. Unlike science, Buddhism doesn't begin with external observations. It starts with direct, subjective experience. It's less concerned with how the stars move and more interested in why the mind suffers. It offers a systematic, experiential exploration of consciousness, a territory science is only beginning to map. But before we explore how these two systems might meet or clash, we need to understand Buddhism on its own terms. If science is a journey outward, a quest to measure the stars and dissect the atom, then Buddhism is a journey inward into the vast, uncharted wilderness of the human mind. For over 2,500 years, Buddhist thinkers, monks, and mystics have turned their gaze not toward the heavens, but toward their own consciousness, not asking what is the universe made of, but why does the heart ache? Why does the mind cling? And is there a way to be truly free? At the heart of this tradition lies a profound recognition. The outer world is fleeting, but the inner world, the world of thoughts, emotions, desires, and awareness, is where our experience of life actually happens. And so, rather than build telescopes, Buddhist practitioners built tools of introspection, meditation, mindfulness, ethical living, disciplines designed not to control the world, but to understand the self. But to truly grasp the Buddhist view, we must first meet its founder, Siddhartha Gautama, the man who became known as the Buddha. Born into privilege as a prince in ancient India, Siddhartha was shielded from the harsh realities of life, until one day, venturing beyond his palace walls, he encountered old age, sickness, and death for the first time. It shattered him. How, he wondered, could life be called beautiful if it was destined to decay? If everything we love will one day slip through our fingers, what is the point of clinging to pleasure, power, or fame? Determined to find an answer, Siddhartha left his palace, his family, and his title behind. For years he wandered, studying with sages, practicing severe asceticism, and finally meditating beneath a Bodhi tree, vowing not to rise until he had uncovered the root of human suffering. And there, in deep stillness, he experienced a profound awakening. He saw that suffering wasn't an inevitable curse cast upon humanity, but a consequence of the way the mind works. We crave what is pleasant. We resist what is painful. We cling to things, people, and ideas as if they were permanent, though, in truth, everything is impermanent. This insight became the foundation of the Four Noble Truths, the core of Buddhist philosophy. Life involves suffering, dukkha, not constant agony, but an underlying dissatisfaction, a sense that things are never quite enough. The cause of suffering is craving, tanha. Our endless desire for pleasure, security, identity, and permanence traps us in a cycle of longing and frustration. There is a way to end suffering. By letting go of attachment and seeing the world clearly, freedom becomes possible. The path to that freedom is the Noble Eightfold Path, a practical guide to ethical living, mental discipline, and wisdom. But here's where Buddhism differs radically from other philosophies, and where it becomes deeply relevant to our conversation about science. Buddhism doesn't ask you to believe anything on faith. The Buddha's core teaching was this: do not accept my words out of reverence, but test them as you would gold by cutting, burning, and rubbing it. In other words, see for yourself. Through meditation and mindfulness, Buddhist practitioners investigate the nature of their own experience. They observe how thoughts arise and pass away. They witness emotions bloom and dissolve. They notice how the mind clings to pleasant sensations and recoils from discomfort. Buddhism closes its eyes, listens to the breath, and watches the mind. Two different paths, perhaps. But are they leading toward the same mystery? As we've seen, science and Buddhism seem to walk along different paths. One gazes outward into galaxies and genes. The other turns inward, toward the flickering candle of consciousness. And yet, like rivers flowing from distant mountains, sometimes their currents meet in surprising, beautiful places. In this chapter, we'll explore those points of harmony, moments when modern science, with all its precision, echoes ancient wisdom spoken beneath banyan trees and within silent monasteries. Let's begin with perhaps the most extraordinary intersection: the science of the mind. For centuries, Buddhist monks claimed that the restless, anxious, craving-driven mind could be calmed, trained, and transformed through meditation. They described states of serene attention, deep compassion, and insight into the nature of reality. To the skeptical, it sounded like mysticism. But science, armed with brain scanners and neuroimaging, decided to take a closer look. And what they found was astonishing. Studies at universities like Harvard, Yale, and MIT have shown that long-term meditation physically changes the brain. Regions associated with attention, empathy, and emotional regulation, such as the prefrontal cortex and insula, grow thicker and more active. Meanwhile, areas linked to stress and fear, like the amygdala, shrink in size and reactivity. Even short-term meditation programs, just 8 weeks long, have been shown to reduce anxiety, improve focus, and enhance overall well-being. In essence, Buddhist practices, refined over millennia through subjective experience, are now being validated by objective measurement, and it doesn't stop there. Consider the concept of impermanence, anicca. Buddhism teaches that all things, from thoughts and feelings to mountains and stars, are in a constant state of flux. Nothing is fixed. Nothing endures. For centuries, this was a philosophical claim. But modern science, especially in the fields of quantum physics and cosmology, reveals the same. Atoms, once thought to be solid, are mostly empty space, their particles flickering in and out of existence. Even the universe itself is expanding, evolving, and one day will transform into something unrecognizable. Everything changes. Nothing lasts forever. Science confirms what sages intuited. And then there's the principle of interdependence, pratityasamutpada. Buddhism teaches that nothing exists independently. Every phenomenon arises due to causes and conditions, and those in turn are shaped by other causes and conditions. It's a deeply ecological, systems-based view of reality. And in recent decades, science has increasingly adopted this perspective. In ecology, we now understand that the fate of a single species is bound to its ecosystem, a delicate, interconnected web where the extinction of bees impacts the growth of crops, which affects food chains, weather patterns, and human survival. In physics, even particles don't exist in isolation. They interact, influence, and respond to fields and forces that stretch across the universe. The deeper science looks, the more it finds a reality of interdependence, not isolation. And here's where it gets truly intriguing. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics, the strange, counterintuitive science of the very small, echo ancient Buddhist ideas. For example, the famous observer effect suggests that the act of observation can influence the outcome of a quantum event. It implies that the division between observer and observed isn't as absolute as classical science once believed. While Buddhist philosophy doesn't speak in terms of wave functions or superpositions, it has long asserted that the mind plays a role in shaping experience. The world we perceive isn't a fixed, external thing, but a dynamic interplay between external conditions and the interpreting mind. Now, let's be clear. We shouldn't stretch these parallels into false equivalencies. Quantum physics is a mathematical model, not a spiritual doctrine. And Buddhist philosophy is a system for ending suffering, not a theory of subatomic particles. But the fact that both traditions, working from opposite directions, sometimes arrive at similar conclusions is humbling. It reminds us that reality is vast, and no single perspective captures its entirety. Another striking convergence comes in the study of consciousness itself. Modern neuroscience has begun to explore the mystery of subjective experience. Why a biochemical brain gives rise to a felt, first-person reality. This is what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. We can measure neurons firing, we can track brain waves, but we still don't know why it feels like something to be you. Buddhism, for its part, has explored consciousness for millennia, not through dissection, but through direct observation. In deep meditation, practitioners observe the arising and passing of thoughts, sensations, and awareness itself. They describe layers of consciousness, from surface-level thinking to profound states of non-dual awareness, where the distinction between subject and object dissolves. Some contemporary scientists, intrigued by these descriptions, have begun collaborating with Buddhist monks, not to convert them, but to learn from their extraordinary mental training. The Dalai Lama himself has partnered with neuroscientists, launching dialogues and research initiatives to better understand the mind. What's remarkable is not that Buddhism and science agree on everything. They don't. But they share a commitment to inquiry, to careful observation, and to the understanding that reality may be more mysterious than either tradition alone can grasp. As the great physicist Niels Bohr once said, "The opposite of a profound truth may well be another profound truth." And perhaps, That's the greatest harmony of all, that these two ancient and modern traditions, one seated in silent meditation, the other in glowing laboratories, both bow before the mystery of existence. While science and Buddhism share many surprising harmonies, the relationship between these two vast traditions is far from simple or seamless. In fact, there are some profound points of tension, where their views not only diverge but seem to pull in opposite directions. Understanding these tensions is crucial because it reminds us that neither science nor Buddhism has all the answers. It also invites us to embrace complexity and uncertainty rather than forcing false resolutions. Let's start with one of the most fundamental points: the nature of reality itself. Science, at its core, assumes an objective reality, a world that exists independently of any observer. No matter who looks, the laws of physics remain the same. Atoms exist whether or not anyone is there to see them. Planets orbit whether or not a human mind perceives their dance. Buddhism, on the other hand, challenges this assumption. From the earliest texts to the most profound meditative insights, Buddhism insists that all phenomena arise in dependence on perception and conditions. In fact, the world we experience is not separate from our minds. It is, to some extent, co-created by how we perceive it. This is not to say the external world doesn't exist. Rather, Buddhism points out that our experience of the world is inseparable from the mind interpreting it. This subtle but powerful shift unsettles the modern scientific worldview. Then there is the question of the self, or rather, the lack of a permanent self. Science tends to look for explanations in the brain. It sees identity as a product of neural networks, memories, and genetics. Buddhism goes further, teaching that the self is an illusion, a convenient fiction constructed by the mind. This doctrine of anatta, or non-self, is both liberating and challenging. It asks us to let go of deeply held beliefs about who we are. For some scientists and philosophers, this notion borders on the mystical, hard to reconcile with empirical study. Another tension lies in the realm of metaphysics and the supernatural. Science, by definition, limits itself to natural explanations, hypotheses that can be tested, observed, and potentially falsified. Buddhism, while famously pragmatic, includes concepts that science struggles to address directly. Rebirth, karma, and realms beyond the physical world are central teachings in many Buddhist traditions. These ideas do not easily fit within a scientific framework. They challenge the materialist view that consciousness ends at death. Some modern Buddhists interpret these teachings metaphorically, as psychological processes or ethical causality. Others hold them as literal truths. Either way, this represents a clear point of divergence. Finally, there is the question of ultimate purpose. Science describes how things happen, but it remains silent on why. It does not provide meaning, purpose, or moral direction. Buddhism is explicitly soteriological. It aims to end suffering and awaken beings to liberation. This teleological dimension can feel foreign or even uncomfortable to the scientific mind, which often avoids normative claims. But tensions do not have to mean conflict. They remind us that science and Buddhism operate in different domains. Science seeks to explain mechanisms and patterns in the external world. Buddhism seeks to transform subjective experience and reveal profound truths about suffering and freedom. When we hold these distinctions with care and humility, the dialogue becomes richer. Rather than forcing either tradition to conform to the other, we can appreciate their unique contributions. As the philosopher Ken Wilber writes, these are different levels of truth, complementary rather than contradictory. Imagine for a moment that the mind is its own universe, vast, complex, and largely unexplored. For centuries, Western science has sought to map this inner cosmos through psychology, neuroscience, and cognitive science. But long before the advent of brain scanners and psychological experiments, Buddhism was already deep into this exploration. Some even call Buddhism a science of the mind, not in the conventional lab sense, but as a rigorous, systematic investigation of consciousness and mental states. What makes Buddhism scientific? First, Buddhism emphasizes direct experience. The Buddha didn't ask his followers to accept teachings blindly. Instead, he encouraged personal verification, testing insights through meditation and mindful observation. This method mirrors the scientific approach of hypothesis, experimentation, and observation, except that the laboratory is the meditator's own mind. Second, Buddhism offers detailed maps of mental phenomena. Texts like the Abhidhamma and Mahayana treatises analyze mental states, emotions, and cognitive processes with astonishing precision. They describe the workings of attention, the roots of craving, and the interplay of perception and reality. These ancient frameworks align closely with modern psychological theories, from cognitive behavioral therapy to mindfulness-based stress reduction. Third, Buddhist meditation techniques function as experiments in consciousness. By observing breath, sensations, or thoughts, practitioners gather data about how the mind functions. They notice how attention wanders, how emotions flare, and how habitual patterns shape experience. Over time, they refine their understanding, much like scientists refining a theory. Consider the practice of mindfulness. Once a niche Buddhist technique, mindfulness has now entered mainstream science and medicine. Hundreds of clinical studies demonstrate its effectiveness for reducing stress, alleviating depression, and enhancing focus. Here, ancient wisdom meets modern validation. Moreover, neuroscience reveals how meditation rewires the brain, increasing neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change. This supports the Buddhist claim that transformation is possible, that suffering is not fixed, but can be alleviated through mental training. Yet Buddhism is more than psychology. It addresses the fundamental problem of dukkha, the unsatisfactoriness and suffering inherent in life. By investigating the causes of suffering, craving, ignorance, and attachment, Buddhism proposes a path to freedom. This is not just theoretical, but experiential. When practitioners realize the impermanence of phenomena and the illusory nature of the self, they begin to loosen the chains of suffering. This profound insight aligns with psychological concepts of detachment and cognitive restructuring, but also transcends them. The Buddhist Noble Eightfold Path serves as a practical guide, combining ethical conduct, mental discipline, and wisdom. It is a holistic system designed to cultivate mental clarity, compassion, and insight. In this way, Buddhism functions as a systematic science of liberation. It doesn't merely describe the mind but offers tools to transform it. Of course, Buddhism differs from conventional science in important ways. It includes ethical and spiritual dimensions that science often sets aside. It focuses on subjective experience rather than only external measurement. But its commitment to empirical inquiry through meditation and mindful living marks it as a unique bridge between spirituality and science. As we reach the end of this exploration, what can we take away from the question, does Buddhism conflict with science? The answer, like much of life, resists simple yes or no replies. Science and Buddhism are not enemies locked in battle, nor are they perfect allies moving in lockstep. They are two profound ways of seeking truth, each with its own methods, languages, and aims. Science asks, what is the nature of the universe? It measures, experiments, and builds models. It excels at explaining how things work. Buddhism asks, what is the nature of suffering? It observes, meditates, and transforms. It offers a path to freedom, insight, and compassion. Yet throughout our journey, we have seen how these traditions touch and intertwine. From the scientific study of meditation's impact on the brain, to the shared recognition of impermanence and interdependence, to the rigorous inquiry into the nature of mind and consciousness. They meet at crossroads, each enriching the other's understanding. At the same time, they hold distinct truths, sometimes in tension, sometimes in paradox. Science remains grounded in the external, the measurable. Buddhism delves into the internal, the experiential. One guides through knowledge and discovery, the other through wisdom and liberation. The path forward is not to force them into a single framework, but to honor their complementarity. To see science and Buddhism as partners in a grand human quest, a quest to understand reality, ourselves, and the mystery of existence. In our modern world, this dialogue is more urgent than ever. As we face global challenges, environmental crises, mental health epidemics, and social fragmentation, the union of scientific insight and Buddhist compassion offers a beacon of hope. It invites us to cultivate mindfulness in action, wisdom in innovation, and kindness in discovery. So, let us not ask if Buddhism and science conflict, but how they can converse, challenge, and inspire each other. May this dialogue awaken new possibilities for healing, understanding, and peace. Thank you for joining this journey of inquiry and reflection. May your path be illuminated by both reason and compassion, and may the harmony of these ancient and modern truths guide your way forward.